So today we are in Psalm 139. This is a classic hymn of praise, and it's a little bit longer than some of the recent Psalms. I'll try for us to get through it today, so before we get into our handout, let's read together Psalm 139, beginning with the heading that says, "For the choir director, a psalm of David. O Lord, you have searched me and known when I sit down and when I rise up. You understand my thought from afar. You scrutinize my path and my lying down, and are intimately acquainted with all my ways. Even before there is a word on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it all. You have enclosed me behind and before, and laid your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is too high. I cannot attain to it. Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, behold, you are there. If I take the wings of the dawn, if I dwell in the remotest part of the sea, even there your hand will lead me, and your right hand will lay hold of me. If I say, surely the darkness will overwhelm me, and the light around me will be night. Even the darkness is not dark to you, and the night is as bright as the day. Darkness and light are alike to you. For you formed my inward parts. You wove me in my mother's womb. I will give thanks to you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, and my soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret and skillfully wrought in the depths of the earth. Your eyes have seen my unformed substance, and in your book were all written the days that were ordained for me, when as yet there was not one of them. How precious also are your thoughts to me, O God! How vast is the sum of them! If I should count them, they would outnumber the sand. When I awake, I'm still with you. Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God. Depart from me, therefore, men of bloodshed, for they speak against you wickedly, and your enemies take your name in vain. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with the utmost hatred. They have become my enemies. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxious thoughts, and see if there be any hurtful way in me, and lead me in the everlasting way." Well, the Lord add blessing to the reading of his word and now to the study of it. If you come to your handout at the front, we'll talk about the impact of this psalm. This is a much-loved psalm. It is very often quoted. There are lots of bookmarks and Christian art that you'll find with parts of this psalm quoted. Many people have memorized particular verses from it. There was a great Jewish scholar in the Middle Ages named Ibn Ezra who called this the crown of the Psalms. And yet, having said that, I'll bet you that you have never seen a bookmark with verse 19. Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God, and depart from me, therefore, men of bloodshed. Those really harsh verses, in verses 19 to 22, are often not understood well. They're certainly not quoted or put into art, but I'm going to present that those difficult verses are actually central to understanding what's going on in this psalm and why David wrote it. Another thing, part of the impact of this psalm, and this is the first blank you can fill in on your handout, is that this psalm is about an applied doctrine of God. So there's a lot of theology in Psalm 139, a lot of discussion of the attributes of God, but David's purpose is to apply that theology to himself. He has a lot of mixed comments about the divine attributes, God's omniscience, how he knows everything, God's omnipresence, how he's everywhere, God's omnificence, which is a rare word about God's creative power. But the psalm is really about applied theology more than anything else, because David stresses again and again that the Lord knows me. and he's present with me no matter where I go. In fact, there are about 30 references to God, and it could be either with the word Lord or with God or with pronouns like you, referring to him. But there's 50 references to David where he refers to himself as I or me or my. So it's a very personalized theology. God is all over David. God sees everything about him. William Brown says that Psalm 139 is a celebration of God's invasion of our privacy. That's great. It's true. And in the sense that you get when you read what David says is he's not concerned about it. He welcomes it. There's a kind of a divine accountability that it brings and really a divine comfort. So the next thing I want us to consider is what kind of psalm is this? What's the genre of it? Is this a psalm of praise? Is it a song of thanks? The best way to describe this is it is a song of trust. A song of trust. Now, it does have at the end of it a lament where he's in essence crying out for God to do something about some very bad people. But most of the psalm is a song of trust. Another great example of a song of trust would be Psalm 23. The Lord's my shepherd, he does this for me and that for me. And there's not a single prayer request in Psalm 23. It's all about what God has done. So this is a song of trust also. Some will call it a song of praise, and some will say it's a song of thanks, because he does say in verse 14, I will give thanks to you, for I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. And there is thanksgiving there. Some others have said this is actually a lament because of the way it ends, but maybe it's better to say, and this is your next blank, that this is a mixed genre psalm. That is, there's more than one kind of poetry in this. It's mostly a song of trust, but it does end with a lament and a plea for God to do something. And as I mentioned before, those hard last verses 19 to 22 in particular, I think are very revealing as to what the backdrop, the setting, the circumstance was that led David to write this psalm. So let's talk about that, the setting. We know who the author is. It tells us in the heading or verse 0 that it's David, a psalm of David. And his lifespan is 1040 to 970 BC. We can't say anything more specific about what time of his life it was. There are no historical headings or notes in the headings. But there are some hints about what's going on in his life in the lament part of the psalm in verses 19, actually all the way to 24. There's even, I think, maybe a hint that's there. And he says in verse 20, I want you to look at that, they speak against you, God, wickedly, and your enemies take your name in vain. They take your name in vain. Now, a lot of times when parents tell their kids to keep their mouth clean, they'll quote that commandment, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, and they'll apply it that way, don't say, oh God, this or whatever. But in the Old Testament, that commandment was mostly, the first application of that was not using God's name to make a false oath about, I swear by the Lord that such and such is true, when such and such wasn't true. So the commandment, you can see in your handout, Exodus 20, verse 7, that's the you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. The Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. I want you to look at that other passage I've listed there, Leviticus 19, verse 12. Leviticus 19, verse 12, you shall not swear falsely by my name, so as to profane the name of the Lord your God. I am the Lord. So there it is. That's that commandment about not taking God's name in vain. It's specifically applied to making a false statement under oath. And the way people would talk, they would say, I call heaven as witness to me that what I'm saying is true. And so how this fits into the background, it looks like what's happening, if you come back to your handout, letter B, David's enemies have falsely sworn about him. They have said that he's done certain things, committed sins, he's said things, been places, he's allied himself, that he has joined himself even with acts of violence. So notice how David wants nothing to do with these bloodthirsty people. He disavows any association with them. Now, ultimately, these are God's enemies, but they are definitely opposing David because he is God's man. So something that David does twice in this section, and here's our next blank, is he disavows any association with these wicked people. I want nothing to do with them. I don't agree with them. I don't hang with them. I don't enjoy them. I don't agree with them. And he uses the harshest language possible to speak about how he doesn't want any association with them. Now, I have something extra to add that you can add into your notes that after I had these printed, I thought, oh, maybe I should mention this too. I want you to look at verse 24. And there's some unusual expressions that David uses. In verse 24, he says, "See if there be any hurtful way in me, and lead me in the everlasting way." Now, two things stand out. One is that the phrase, the everlasting way, that's the only time that phrase shows up in the Old Testament. And the other one is right above it, the hurtful way. Now, it might be literally the way of pain. The way of pain. See if there be any way of pain in me. Now, here's the thing. The word for pain has another word in Hebrew that looks just like it. It rhymes with it, it's spelled the same way, and it means idol. See, and maybe this is the accusation they're making against him. See if there be any way of idolatry in me. Could this be one of the accusations that they were making about him? That he was actually an idol worshiper. And he's laying himself open before God. Lord, you know me. You know what's true of me. See if there is anything like that in me. As far as I know, there's nothing like that in me. It's hard to be, I don't want to be dogmatic about it. It's possible. But at a minimum, there are violent people, godless people who are making these accusations, who are saying, David's like us. What period of life could this be from? We can't say for certain. I mean, could it be during those years when Saul was hunting David down, and Saul had people in his court who were pro-Saul, anti-David, and they were trying to sway people against David? Could it have been in the days of Absalom's rebellion, when Absalom is swinging people's loyalty away from David, and all sorts of things are said against him? We don't know. We do know that David faced this kind of thing more than once. Throughout the psalm, David finds comfort in knowing that God knows exactly what he's done and said. And he writes this way in other places. I've listed for you two other psalms I want us to look at. One of them is Psalm 17. So turn back to that. Psalm 17. We'll read just a few verses. Psalm 17, "Hear a just cause, O Lord, and give heed to my cry. Give ear to my prayer, which is not from deceitful lips. Let my judgment come forth from your presence. Let your eyes look with equity. You have tried my heart. You have visited me by night. You have tested me, and you find nothing. I have purposed that my mouth will not transgress. As for the deeds of men, by the word of your lips I have kept from the paths of the violent. My steps have held fast to your paths. My feet have not slipped." What seems to be behind this is David has been falsely accused by people, that he's a violent man, that he's a godless man. And he says, Lord, you know me. You know what is in my heart, and you know that these accusations are false. He prays this way again in Psalm 26. Flip forward to Psalm 26, verses 1 to 3. Vindicate me, O Lord, for I have walked in my integrity, and I have trusted in the Lord without wavering. Examine me, O Lord, and try me. Test my mind and my heart. For your loving kindness is before my eyes, and I have walked in your truth. I do not sit with deceitful men, nor will I go with pretenders. I hate the assembly of evildoers, and I will not sit with the wicked. I shall wash my hands in innocence. I will go about your altar, O Lord, that I may proclaim with a voice of thanksgiving and declare all your wonders. There's a lot of similar language in these verses with what we've just read a while ago in Psalm 139. And I think these hard verses at the end of Psalm 139, the unpopular, not well understood verses, actually give us a window into what was going on in David's life. And we can't be absolutely certain about details of that background, but this understanding goes a long way in explaining what these hard verses are doing in this beautiful psalm. So on your handout, on the far right side, there's a few comments about the placement. Psalm 139 is by David. A few psalms earlier was written hundreds of years after his. So what we have in this part of the Psalms 138 to 145, these are the last 8 Psalms of David that are, not the last 8 that he wrote, but in the collection of the Psalms, these are the last 8 that we find. And what we read in Psalm 139 has some expressions that are familiar with what we looked at last week in Psalm 138. Psalm 138, verse 6, talks about God's awareness. He regards the lowly. He's mindful of those who are humble. And in Psalm 139, verse 2, you know when I sit down, when I rise up. You understand. God's right hand is mentioned in Psalm 138 in verse 7 and again in Psalm 139. There are unholy enemies that David has in Psalm 138, and there's unholy enemies he has in this one. So there's some little hinges that connect these psalms together. Let me make some comments about and observations about the psalm as a whole. One thing that stands out is that Psalm 139 has beautiful symmetry. It's one of the most symmetrical of all the psalms. And by that I mean there's 4 movements that break up the psalm, and each of them are made of 6 verses. There are some psalms that are evenly paced like this, but most are not. The first 3 movements basically have the same structure, and when we come to the chart on the back in a little bit, we'll observe that. That 4th section is different. It has a little bit different flow to it. Another thing to note about Psalm 139 is it has very sophisticated poetry. It has got ahead of myself with the A, sophisticated poetry. The style that David used is among his most refined, and there are a number of very rare Hebrew words that he uses, some of which appear almost nowhere else or just a few times, and he has some very striking visual pictures that he makes. In fact, I'll point out some of those on the next page. Letter C, the psalm has some eruptions of praise. Verse 6, he says, such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It's high, too high. I cannot attain to it. And verse 14 also erupts in praise. I will give thanks to you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. And verses 17 and 18, which close down the section of trust, are full of praise. How precious are your thoughts to me. They're more than the sands of the sea in number. Beautiful eruptions of praise. And letter D, this psalm is famous for what it says about the divine attributes, the characteristics of God. These verses are very often quoted in books of systematic theology, which describe God's attributes. And 3 attributes that are talked about quite a bit are, firstly, God's omniscience, how he knows everything. And again, notice that the way David explains it or applies it is, you know everything about me. And if that's true of him, of course, it would be true of others too. God knows everything. God's omnipresence is celebrated. Where can I go from your spirit? And he lists possible places that maybe someone might think they could get away from God. I was in one of my seminary classes this week, we were talking about Jonah, and there's some interesting parallels between this psalm and Jonah's experience. Jonah is trying to get away from God's presence, but it doesn't work. Wherever he goes, even trying to go on the far side of the sea, he can't get away from God's presence. David doesn't want to get away from God's presence. He welcomes it because the Lord sees him for who he really is. God's universal presence. And then here's your $50 word for the day. The others were $25 words, but the $50 word is omniscience. Omniscience. This is God's unlimited creative power. You, God, you made me when I was inside my mother's womb. You were there all of those weeks and months of gestation. You were present with me. And so he's saying, not only does God know everything about me, God knows everywhere I've been, anywhere I could go, and from the very beginning of my life, he's been with me and creating me and making me. And again, these attributes are not discussed in an abstract way, but they're applied to David personally. Letter E. There are some important imprecations. That's another $50 word, but I've used it a lot before, so I guess the value has gone down. An imprecation is a word of judgment, a prayer of judgment. There are critics of the Bible, critics of this psalm, who say, verses 19 to 22 ruin this psalm. It's a beautiful psalm of trust, and then you get to this hateful, judgy stuff, and that, why did David put it? And usually they say David didn't put it in there, someone else did. And I'll admit that those verses there are times when it may not be most appropriate to read those. When I go to the hospital and someone's laying there recovering in the bed and they want to hear from Psalm 139, I'm probably only going to read portions of Psalm 139. I'm probably not going to read verses 19 to 24. When I teach it, it's going to be different. But there's, the New Testament will quote parts of passages. It doesn't feel like it has to quote every single verse all the time. But we don't need to be embarrassed about these verses. They are harsh, but they are also holy. They're part of God's inspired word. And as I mentioned before, I think they inform us a lot about what the background is behind the psalm. Go to the back page, and I'll mention some key concepts. The idea of God searching and knowing everything, that's mentioned in the very first verse. "O Lord, you have searched me and known me." And then at the end of the psalm, he asks God to do it again. "Search me, O God, and know my heart." God's knowledge is described throughout the psalm, especially in the first 6 verses. God's wonders, he says in verse 6, "Such knowledge, the knowledge you have of everything about me, such knowledge is too wonderful for me." Now, that doesn't mean this is so thrilling, I can hardly believe it. It means this is impossible. That's a wonder. That's a miracle. I couldn't do that. I can't have that kind of knowledge. That's above my pay grade. That's God's wonders, that he can know everything. And verse 14, he uses the same version of the same word. "I will give thanks to you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made." That is, there's a miraculous power at work in your crafting of the human being. His ability to make me as I am is one of God's wonders. And God's thoughtful care is found all throughout the psalm, especially when you look at verse 18. If I could count all of your caring thoughts toward me, there's not enough sand in the sea to correspond to each of those. There are very vivid pictures used throughout the psalm. Letter G, God's presence is omnidimensional. That is, not only in this world, but in even the heavenly and the otherworldly realms, God is there. In verse 8, he says, "If I ascend to heaven," and that seems to be the heaven of heavens where the Lord dwells, you are there. That's not a surprise. But "if I make my bed in Sheol," if I go into the realm of the dead, you are there. Now, God's presence in the realm of the dead, the experience of God's presence varies depending on your relationship with the Lord, whether you are at peace with him or under judgment. But God is present in some sense. And then verse 9 talks about his presence being omnidirectional, from the far east to the far west. God is present. He mentions in verse 9 the wings of the dawn. If I take the wings of the dawn. So this is describing sunrise. And of course, the sun rises in the east. And as the sun comes up on that horizon, the sun is low, but that light shoots straight across. And he's imagining, imagine if I could get on the wing, or the word wing is sometimes used for a sun ray, like in Malachi 4, it means a sunbeam. If I could get up with the sun and shoot across the horizon all the way to the far end of the sea, and the far end of the sea in Israel is the Mediterranean, that's the west. This is like going out to Tarshish, out to Spain, as far as you could possibly go. There's no span, east or west, that God is not to be found. Another vivid picture is the oppressive darkness in verses 11 and 12. He speaks about darkness as a kind of a situational danger. If I say, surely the darkness will overwhelm me, and the light around me will be night, so he's kind of concerned about darkness in some sense. In fact, the word overwhelm that's used there, the Hebrew word is, even the darkness will bruise me. So there's some kind of threat against him. But God is not blinded or bound by darkness. It's just like it was daylight to him. People think they're getting away with all kinds of things in the dark. And God is not fooled. David couldn't get away with anything. David's enemies can't get away with anything. God sees. God is present. He mentions in verse 15 another image, the depth of the earth. My frame, that's my bodily frame, was not hidden from you when I was made in secret, skillfully wrought in the depths of the earth. Now, verse 14, verse 16 are clearly describing his experience in the womb. He calls that the depth of the earth. And that seems to be an idiom to talk about things that are unseen or hidden. You know, in ancient days, there were no scopes or MRIs or anything like that could give you an image of what was happening in that gestational realm. And so that may as well be in the depths of the earth as far as a person was considered. But God saw, and the same God who made Adam out of the dust of the ground is present even in these dark, earthy places, bringing together David's being. At number 5, there's an image of God's limitless love. God's caring thoughts about us are more than can be imagined, more than all the grains of sand. So I'll give you a little homework assignment. After these storms have passed and the weather is a little bit more tolerable, you go down to Huntington Beach or some place on the coast that's your favorite spot, and you sit down there and you take up a scoop of sand and you separate them all and count every single one. And by the time you're done, you're nowhere near counting out the number of gracious thoughts that God has towards you. That's the kind of beautiful image David has in mind in verses 17 and 18. A few more thoughts before we go verse by verse. David, letter H, mentions a ringleader, and where I'm getting that is that the term wicked in verse 19, when he says, "Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God," that word wicked in verse 19 is singular. It's not wicked people, it's the wicked man. Oh, that you would slay the wicked man, O Lord. And then after mentioning this one man, he mentions other men. Depart from me, men of bloodshed. They speak against you. They are your enemies. I hate those. So what seems to be there's one guy who was the ringleader in accusing David, getting other people to side against him, and David pleads for God to stop him, to stop his tongue, to stop all these other people who are connected with him. And then David makes, in letter I, your handout, holy disassociation, or the word we used earlier with how he disavows. He swears off any contact with them. David's hatred of God's enemies is really more about his disassociating himself from them more than anything else. He does not endorse them. He does not associate with them. He disavows any connection with them. And part of their accusation seems to be, he's like us. He's as evil as we are and involved in the same things that we are. And as his appeal, letter J, David submits himself to God to inspect him. After praying those harsh, strong prayers of judgment in verses 19 to 22, David submits himself to divine inspection. Verse 23, search me, O God, and know my heart. David submits himself for God to inspect him, because he knows that in the end, what matters most is what God thinks of him, not what men think of him. Now, I want to make a little add-on here. I think a wrong way to apply what I just said would be for someone to say, I'm not going to listen to anybody else. Don't anybody else hold me to account or tell me I'm living in sin or what have you. This is not saying don't listen to people. I mean, David had to listen to Nathan the prophet when Nathan came and said, you are the man. So that's not the time to pray Psalm 139. So this psalm should not be used as an excuse to ignore the correction of other people. This is the psalm you use when people are making false accusations against you, and you take comfort in knowing God knows what's true about me, and God will vindicate me. The last blank you've got in your handout is about anxiety. David attacks anxiety through prayer. He doesn't have an anxiety attack. He attacks anxiety through prayer. He prays for divine inspection to battle the anxious thoughts that his problems have brought to him. I mean, when people are making false accusations, that's stressful. So he asks for God to alleviate this, try me and know my anxious thoughts. He wants God to comb through his thinking and help him deal with those things as well as to vindicate his name. All right, now I have just like 10, 15 minutes. I want us to go through the visual outline chart that you got at the bottom of that page. We'll use this to go through the psalm verse by verse. And I put a purpose statement in the top of the chart there. It says, confident in his relationship with the all-knowing God, David takes comfort in praying to Yahweh, who knows the truth about him, giving him boldness to face severe false accusations about his participation in wicked violence. Over on the left side of the chart in the green column, there's a note about the three headings that there are. It says, for the choir director, that's authorization that David gave to the sanctuary choir director to assign this poem to be played, what musicians would sing it, and when it would be sung. It says it's a psalm of David, the word mitzmor, which means a song that's intended to have musical accompaniment. And then there's a note of authorship that it's by David. The poem itself is covered in those blue and gray sections. Most of the psalm, if you move over to the blue box, is a confession of trust. Verses 1 to 18. He delights in Yahweh's personal knowledge. And this confession of trust has three segments in it. Verses 1 to 6, the first segment is Yahweh's penetrating knowledge. He affirms Yahweh's personal inspection in verse 1. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You've been active in my life. You see everything. And then he meditates on this personal inspection in verses 2 to 4 by saying how the Lord knows all of his activities, verses 2 and 3. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You understand my thought from afar. So you observe everything I do, even the most simple of things. You even know inside my head, even though it seems like you're far away, it's as if you're right there. And then verse 3, again, his activities. You scrutinize my path and my lying down. You know everywhere I go. You know everywhere I rest. You're intimately acquainted with all my ways, all of my activities. And verse 4, you have knowledge of all my words. Even before there's a word on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it all. You know everything I've said, every single thing. I think there were false accusations about what David said and where he'd gone and what he did. But the Lord knows. So after meditating on that, the last two verses of this segment is a celebration of Yahweh's knowledge. How that's an intimate and supportive knowledge. In verse 5, you have enclosed me behind and before, laid your hand on me. So your presence with me is not, it's not oppressive. Yes, it's close. You're all around me, but your hand is on me in this affirming way. And all of this knowledge is miraculous and divine, verse 6. Such knowledge, the kind of knowledge you have about me, it's too much of a wonder. It's miraculous. It's more than what I could do. It's too wonderful for me. It is too high. I cannot attain to it. I can't begin to have this kind of knowledge of anything. This is Yahweh's penetrating knowledge. Verses 7 to 12 is about Yahweh's personal presence. And just like the first segment began with affirming the reality of that, of his inspection, so also verse 7 is going to be an affirmation of Yahweh's universal presence. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? And of course the answer to that is nowhere. But he's going to meditate on Yahweh's presence in the next three verses, how he's present above and below. In verse 8, if I ascend to heaven, you're there, of course, you're there. If I make my bed in Sheol, if I go into the realm of the dead, behold, you are there. You know, in the story of Jonah had, he was in the sea, and the Lord above sent down a storm, so the Lord was up there, and Jonah goes down in the water, and he's in the fish, and he describes his experience in the fish as if he was in Sheol. He was as good as dead. I mean, that's what happens when people get eaten by fish. You know, they die. He doesn't die, though, but and the Lord is present with him, even there at the gates of death. So from above and below, from east to west, verses 9 and 10, again, we talked about the wings of the dawn and shooting across the horizon. If I take the wings of the dawn, if I dwell in the remotest part of the sea, even there your hand will lead me, and your right hand will lay hold of me. That's something Jonah should have remembered when he thought about running away to the far west. Verses 11 and 12 is a celebration of Yahweh's presence. David is concerned about the darkness in verse 11. If I come to a situation in life where I feel like darkness is going to be dangerous for me, surely the darkness will overwhelm me, bruise me, and the light around me will be night. Verse 12, even the darkness is not dark to you, and the night is as bright as the day. Darkness and light are alike to you. Yahweh has full awareness of the darkness. David can't get away with anything in the dark. David's enemies can't get away with anything in the dark. The Lord sees all. The third movement in verses 13 to 18 is about Yahweh's kind omniscience, his kind creative power. And just as before, it opens up in verse 13 with an affirmation that Yahweh has this intimate creative work. Verse 13, for you formed my inward parts. You wove me in my mother's womb. So look at this, that even though David was not created by a direct act of God, he wasn't made like Adam was out of the dirt of the ground, still in this creative experience of husband and wife coming together and a child being created and fashioned, God is present even in that. This does have some things to say about the whole issue of abortion, that God is present with the unborn from the very beginning. And after affirming that in general, he now, here's where it's a little different. Instead of meditating on it right away, he gives a pledge of thanks for Yahweh's personal creation in verse 14. I will give thanks to you. I'm going to publicly acknowledge you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. It's almost miraculous to think about the way that a little something of nothing grows into a full-grown man. It engenders in me a sense of fear, a holy fear for your power and wonder at your ability. Wonderful are your works. Miraculous are your works, including the making of me. And my soul knows it very well. Verses 15 to 16, he meditates more on Yahweh's personal creation. Verse 15 is about his prenatal development. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret, skillfully wrought in the depths of the earth, or as we mentioned before, that depths of the earth is a metaphor for an impossible to get to, unseen, invisible place. I mean, before the days of ultrasound, none of us could see any of that. The best we could get was, put your hand on the tummy and feel a kick. But God saw it all, from the very beginning of those cells coming together to the full-grown development. And then verse 16, in the ordaining of his lifespan. Even before he was born, the full number of his days were already counted out. Look at verse 16. Your eyes have seen my unformed substance, and in your book were all written the days that were ordained for me, when as yet there was not one of them. You've had my life planned from before my birth. This is his kind, creative power. David is taking great comfort in knowing God is with him. God's with him all the time. God's with him in every place. God's been with him through his whole life, even before he was born. And that leads him in verses 17 and 18 to give a celebration of Yahweh's personal creation. Verse 17, he talks about God's care being is valued so greatly. How precious also are your thoughts to me, your thoughts about me, your care for me, O God. How vast is the sum of them. God's care is infinitely great, as verse 18 says. If I should count them, that all of your gracious, caring thoughts about me, they would outnumber the sand. When I awake, I'm still with you. Now, that's an interesting little line, isn't it? It might imply that David was meditating on this and thinking of all the ways God thinks about him, and maybe he fell asleep and woke up, and he still got more to think about God's presence. He's not exhausted thinking about and rejoicing in God's care for him. And then we come to the last 6 verses. There's a major shift. I mean, if Psalms were like vehicles, you would hear the gears crunching as you come to verse 19, because there's a very, very different last 6 verses. These 6 verses are a lament, a prayer for God's intervention against false witnesses. And verses 19 to 22 is an imprecation, a prayer of judgment against the wicked. Particularly, it starts off with a prayer of judgment on the ringleader. As I mentioned, verse 19 has a singular noun. Oh, that you would slay the wicked man, O God. There seems to be one ringleader who's pushing this agenda, these false accusations against David, and David calls on him to take care of him. And right after making that harsh prayer of judgment, now notice, by the way, David leaves judgment in God's hands. He doesn't take up the sword himself. He's not vengeful. He's doing what the Bible says, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. In the second part of verse 19, David uses I've mentioned it before, this is called an apostrophe. The word apostrophe means turning aside. I ran out of space there, that's bad. To turn aside. He actually talks to the wrongdoers. Depart from me, therefore, men of bloodshed. These are the kind of wicked people he's talking about. They are violent, they're liars, and he goes on to describe them after disavowing. That's his way of saying, I don't want anything to do with you. I'm not like you. Verse 20, here are the reasons for this imprecation. The first is that they're speaking against God. For they speak against you wickedly. They speak against him, and that would include God's plan, God's choice, God's key individuals. So people like David, who was the Lord's anointed one. And your enemies take your name in vain. That they are making, and I think that means they're making false oaths of accusation, claiming David's done things that he hasn't done. And verse 21 and 22, he makes another disavowal. Look, I don't want anything to, I don't want to be like these people. I don't want to be around them. Verse 21, do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? Of course, the Lord knows what his desires are. Do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with the utmost hatred. They have become my enemies. Now, we're uncomfortable with these words, probably because our Lord Jesus taught us, love your enemies, pray for those who despitefully use you. So when we encounter prayers of expressions of judgment like this, we're a little uncomfortable. But if you understand the context, that what David is doing is saying, I want nothing to do with these people. There may well come a time for him to show kindness and mercy and forgiveness and for these people to be saved. But in terms of his allegiance and his what David is dedicated doing, he wants it to be known, I am not like them. It's by God's grace. It's because God has been with me and shown kindness to me, but let it be known, I am not like that. And so then he submits himself, the last two verses, to divine inspection. If anyone says, oh, David, you're just being harsh and judgmental, he says, look, I appeal to God. Search me, O God, and know my heart. The same words that were used earlier. You have done this, and I ask you to keep doing it. I submit myself to God's inspection. Try me and know my anxious thoughts. He wants some relief from these false accusations. There's anxiety that's developing within him, and he wants God to vindicate him. And then he prays in verse 24 to remove any grievous way. See if there be any hurtful way in me. Maybe that just means any way of pain, any direction I'm going in that's going to bring pain on me, shame on you. It's possible that expression should be rendered, as I mentioned before, the way of an idol. But whichever it is, at the end of the psalm, look at this, his desire to go God's way. Lead me in the everlasting way. I want to go in the way of truth, the way of your glory, the paths that you have set forth in your word. This is what I am dedicated to. So these last two verses are a prayer, and that's what they are in their form. They also, though, have the function of being David's sort of asserting his innocence. And I appeal to God. God, you vindicate me, and let it be known what is true. And if there is anything that's not true about me, then make it known also to me. So there's a lot of comfort to be found in this. You and I probably don't have enemies like David had. We have family members who are maybe upset with us for our Christian faith, or you have neighbors or what have you, but most of us probably don't have the kind of enemies that he has. But we do face false accusations and misunderstanding, and maybe not from desperately wicked people, maybe from fellow Christians who don't think the best of us. The good thing is God knows. God knows what's what. God knows who's who. God knows what's true. And we need to imitate the prayer of David to keep lifting ourselves up to God's inspection and let him reveal to us if there is anything and if there is any truth to the accusations that are brought against us, so that we might go God's way and not our way. Well, let's ask God to bless what we studied this morning. Father, thank you for this time in your word. It is encouraging. It's challenging. We praise you, God, that you are present. You're present all the time, whether we feel it or not. You are present wherever we go. You know us inside and out. And may those thoughts, may they challenge us when needed to do what's right, and may they comfort us to know that you are with us. Thank you for the hope of the gospel that makes it possible for people like us who, without Christ, are evildoers and sinners, that we can be made right with you. We rejoice in this position we have in Jesus, and we pray in his name. Amen.